Summer 1941. Operation Barbarossa. German crews pushed deep into the Soviet Union. The StuG followed, clearing paths for the infantry with high-explosive rounds. It worked in France. It worked in Poland. But the Russian steppe prepared a different reality. A massive silhouette emerged from the dust, a Soviet KV-1. The German gunner aimed and fired. A dull metallic thud echoed across the field. The 75mm shell hit the turret directly. It didn't penetrate. It didn't even leave a dent. The heavy Soviet tank didn't stop. It kept moving, crushing everything in its path. Panic spread through the ranks. Why was the German weapon suddenly useless? The crews watched in horror as their standard rounds simply bounced off the thick armor of T-34 and KV-1 tanks. The enemy possessed superior protection and massive firepower. German anti-tank guns were effectively firing pebbles. Soviet command errors bought Berlin some time. Poor organization blunted the initial Red Army counterstrikes. But the technical gap was a death sentence. The Wehrmacht lacked a mobile answer to the Soviet steel tide. Berlin ordered an immediate search for a solution. The cause of this impotence lay in blueprints approved a year before the invasion. In 1936, the High Command demanded a mobile bunker buster. Engineers stripped the turret from a Panzer III chassis. They replaced it with a fixed steel box. Why build a tank without a turret? A turret adds weight, height, and mechanical complexity. The new vehicle, the Sturmgeschütz, stood less than 2 meters tall. A soldier could stand next to the hull and look across the roof. It was a ghost on the battlefield. Easy to hide in a tree line, nearly impossible to hit from a distance. Inside the cramped casemate, the gunner sat shoulder to shoulder with the loader. There was no room for error. Their weapon was a short 75mm stub gun. It was perfect for cracking concrete pillboxes, but it had a fatal flaw. The muzzle velocity was 420 meters per second. That is half the speed required to punch through heavy tank steel. It was a specialist tool forced into a general war. In 1940, during the Battle of France, the StuG performed its job perfectly. It demolished bunkers. It supported the infantry. Contrast, Berlin saw a masterpiece of siege warfare. The crews saw a metal trap that couldn't fight back against a moving target. The StuG belonged to the artillery branch, not the panzers. The men inside were gunners, trained to hit stationary targets from cover. They lacked the aggressive instincts of tank hunters. As the armor thickened and machine guns were bolted to the roofs, one reality remained. Against a T-34, the short-barreled gun was a toy. The crews waited in the grass, watching Soviet steel approach. Their shells simply bounced off. The air inside the cabin grew heavy with the smell of spent cordite and sweat. This machine of death was not designed by tankers. It was the brainchild of artillerymen who dreamed of a mobile gun. The strategy was simple. The infantry moves and the cannon follows. Towed artillery was too slow for the new German blitzkrieg. It got stuck in the mud. It stayed behind. The solution was the Sturmgeschütz, a low-profile beast built on the Panzer III chassis. 10,000 units rolled off the assembly lines. It became the most produced German armored vehicle of the war. But numbers hide the butcher's bill. By the final months, only 1,100 remained operational. The crews were not elite panzer divisions. They belonged to the artillery branch. They wore gray, not black. They lacked the prestige of the Tiger Aces, but they took the brunt of the fire. The cost was absolute. 80% of StuG crews became casualties before the end. Only a tenth of the machines survived to see the surrender. 1,070 vehicles. The Wehrmacht faced a choice. They could lose the entire fleet of machines or turn their artillery into hunters. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet T-34s were no longer a surprise. They were a death sentence. How did one detail change the course of these battles? The answer was a long-barreled 75mm gun. It was a modified Pak-40, forced into the cramped casemate of the StuG. The silhouette changed. Engineers removed the short, blunt, stubby howitzer. They bolted in the long-barreled anti-tank gun. The new barrel poked far beyond the hull's front. It looked front-heavy, dangerous. The sound changed too. Instead of the dull thud of a howitzer, the long 75mm gun produced a sharp, whip-like crack. High muzzle velocity, pure kinetic energy. This new, long arm allowed the StuG to strike T-34s from 1,000 meters. The crews didn't need thick armor. They used the earth. The low silhouette meant they could vanish into a fold in the terrain or sit behind a patch of tall grass. From there, they were invisible until the first shot. One hidden StuG could decimate an entire advancing platoon in the open. It was a technical mutation born of a crisis. The infantry support vehicle died in the mud of the Eastern Front. In its place stood Germany's most effective tank destroyer. Look at their shoulders. Not the pink piping of the Panzer Corps. They wore red, the color of the artillery. Who sat inside these low-profile killers? Not tankers, gunners. The distinction changed everything. A tanker thinks about maneuvers and breakthroughs. An artilleryman thinks about geometry and ballistics. Kurt Nispel, the highest-scoring ace of the war, mastered this math. He didn't just pull levers. Nispel leaned into the specialized optics. He calculated the lead. He factored in the wind. One shot, one kill. 160 times. The red-tabbed crews treated the StuG like a mobile sniper's nest. They didn't charge, they waited. Hidden in the tall grass or behind a collapsed farmhouse, they turned the Eastern Front into a graveyard. The scale of the slaughter is hard to grasp. 30,000 Soviet tanks. That was the final tally for the StuG. 30,000. It is a number larger than the entire Soviet tank park at the start of the war. These assault guns destroyed more armor than any Tiger or Panther. The machine was a predator by design, but the men made it lethal. They used the 75mm gun with surgical precision. At 500 meters, the high-velocity shell punched through 90mm of solid steel. It didn't matter if it was a Sherman, a Churchill, or the latest T-34. The armor simply gave way. The Battle of Kursk, July 1943. The largest tank engagement in history. Amidst the chaos of Operation Citadel, one machine redefined the kill ratio. It wasn't the Tiger or the Panther, it was the StuG-3. How do you lose only 8 vehicles in the hell of Kursk? The answer lies in ambush tactics. The statistics from the summer of 1943 look like an anomaly. One battalion reported 423 Soviet tanks destroyed. Their own losses? 8 machines. 423 to 8. This meant the destruction of 2 entire Soviet tank corps by a single unit. These weren't lucky shots. They were the result of artillery precision. The crews utilized high-quality optics to strike from cover before the enemy even spotted a target. They stayed low. They waited. The high command saw these numbers and reacted. They stopped treating StuG crews as mere infantry support. Tactics shifted to maximize these lethal ambush profiles across the entire front. While battalions tallied destroyed T-34s, mechanics in the rear worked to save crews from the inevitable return fire. By 1943, the StuG was no longer a light support vehicle. It was a 24-ton slab of specialized steel. Frontal armor jumped to 80mm. Thick enough to stare down a Sherman or a Churchill. But the crews felt the gaps. They saw the welds. Why did men start pouring concrete over the nose of their machines? It wasn't for ballistic physics. It was for the mind. Thick layers of cement added weight but barely stopped a shell. It provided the illusion of a bunker. Survival required more than psychological tricks. Soviet anti-tank rifles were everywhere. Thousands of them. A single high-velocity round could find the thin side plating and kill the loader instantly. Imagine the sound. A sharp metallic crack as a Soviet slug hits the new side skirts. These were the Scherzen. Thin metal screens designed to tumble the bullet before it touched the main hole. The trade-off was brutal. To keep the front impenetrable, the Germans left the top naked. 10mm of steel on the roof. That is less than half an inch. A heavy machine gun from a second-story window or a fragment from a Soviet bomb could peel the cabin open like a tin can. 80mm in the front. The high command ignored the vulnerability of the roof to keep production lines moving. Command viewed the casualty reports from the summer heat of Kursk and ordered an immediate increase in chassis orders. Berlin no longer cared about the vulnerability of the roof. The production numbers after the summer of 1943 mattered more. The High Command looked at the scorched fields of Kursk and saw a grim reality. Tanks were dying. Replacements were too slow. The shift was immediate. Germany moved toward a turretless war. Imagine the factory floor. On one side, a Tiger tank. It requires a massive steel turret, complex traverse gears, and electric motors. On the other side, the StuG. A simple, welded steel box fixed directly to the hull. No turret. No ball bearings for the ring. Just a gun and a casemate. The cost was the ultimate weapon. A single StuG cost 82,000 Reichsmarks. A Panzer IV cost over 100,000. A Tiger? 300,000. For the price of one Tiger, the Reich could put 4 StuGs on the front line. The math of defeat was simple. Berlin pushed this logic to the extreme. They stripped the Panzer IV of its turret to create the StuG IV. They took the Panther and turned it into the Jag Panther. Eventually, they built monsters. The Jag Tiger, the Sturm Tiger with its naval rocket launcher. These giants were failures. They were too heavy. They broke down on the march. They cost a fortune. Yet the simple StuG kept rolling off the lines. It was the only thing the economy could still breathe into existence. By the end of the war, the industry abandoned the tank. For every one Panzer produced, the factories delivered 4 turretless vehicles. Berlin's factories pumped out thousands of machines. But inside every steel shell lay a structural death sentence. The Reich no longer saw crews as soldiers. They were disposable assets. The StuG was a sniper, built for open fields. In 1944, it was shoved into the meat grinder of urban combat. Why did a single side hit mean certain death for all 4 men? The answer was the single fighting compartment. A tank with a turret separates the crew with a massive steel breech. In the StuG, 4 men sat shoulder to shoulder in one tight box. Imagine the impact. A solid armor-piercing shell punches through the side. There are no bulkheads, no internal shields. The dull clang of the hit is the last thing they hear. White-hot shrapnel sprays the entire interior instantly. 1 penetration, 4 casualties. It was a collective coffin. The tactical situation was worse. In the ruins of broken cities, the StuG had no infantry to clear corners. Allied planes owned the sky. Without air cover or tank support, the casemates were blind to flanking maneuvers. A single soldier with a handheld anti-tank weapon could end the entire crew from a basement window. By the final months, the veterans were gone. Replacement crews arrived with minimal training and zero morale. These teenagers stepped into the single fighting compartment, knowing it was an undivided tomb. They went into hopeless battles with half-empty fuel tanks and no preparation. The steel box waited. Inside, the 4 men sat together, waiting for the hit that would take them all. 1 Tiger was a statement. 4 StuGs were a strategy. Germany traded quality for volume, but numbers couldn't fix a collapsing map. While crews died in the ruins of cities, the High Command threw the remaining machines into every breach. How long does a fire brigade last without fuel? Until the first empty tank. The logistics of retreat turned elite units into disposable plugs. StuG battalions became fire brigades for a burning front. The army rushed them from one crisis point to another. They saw the worst fighting, survived, and were immediately sent to the next gap. It was a mechanism of self-destruction. In the Ardennes and near Lake Balaton, the machines didn't fall to enemy shells. They simply stopped. The production ratio of 4-to-1 kept the numbers up, but the fuel trucks never arrived. A StuG with an empty tank is just a 30-ton bunker. When the Red Army or the Western Allies bypassed these positions, the crews faced a final choice. An Unteroffizier opened the hatch. He didn't look for a target. He grabbed a standard explosive charge and placed it inside the breech of the 75mm gun. The crew scrambled out, sliding down the cold armor into the mud. A muffled blast distorted the barrel from the inside. They left the engines silent and the hatches open. The crew destroyed their own vehicle to prevent capture. 10,000 units rolled off the assembly lines. By 1945, only 1,300 remained. The rest were scrap metal, abandoned husks, or craters in the dirt. 90% of the fleet vanished. The crews didn't just lose to enemy fire, they blew the breaches themselves. They left their machines in ditches because the fuel trucks never arrived. By the final months, this legendary mass production looked like a rounding error. 1,300 machines is less than the factories produced in a single 6-month peak. The math of the collapse was simple. Allied anti-tank guns evolved. The StuG, a pre-war design, did not. It became a disposable patch for a tearing front. Commanders threw them into hopeless urban meat grinders with zero preparation. It was no longer a tactical weapon, it was a suicide note. History remembers the Tiger and the Panther. The public knows the heavy steel, but the numbers tell a different story. This low turretless Shadow became the most successful tank killer of the entire conflict. It was Germany's deadliest armored vehicle.